My name is Haley Zega, and today we'll be exploring the strange history and crumbling ruins of the once thriving resort town known as Monte Ne, Arkansas. Let's get lost. It is a hot one today, y'all, so if you see me sweating through my makeup, please don't judge me too harshly. So at the turn of the last century, there was no lake here, and in 1900, this land was purchased by an eccentric businessman turned politician turned doomsday prepper, and he built a resort town. And at its peak, this town of Monte Ne boasted multiple hotels and several innovations that were brand new to the area, but we'll get into all of that later. So let's talk about this land before it was a tourist attraction and long before there was a lake here. Like virtually all land in the United States and indeed North America, the original stewards of this land were Native American indigenous peoples. This region was originally inhabited and used by the Caddo, Quapaw, Osage, and Cherokee peoples, just to name a few. So eventually, white settlers moved in and the area was organized into a community known as Silver Springs. The earliest mention I could find of Silver Springs was for 1895, and to call this place a town would be a tad generous, but they did have a distillery and a grist mill, so, you know, booze and bread, just the essentials. So like I said, in 1900, the area that once was Silver Springs was purchased, but by whom? So let's talk about Coin Harvey, whose real name was William Hope Harvey. Now, throughout this video, I'm going to be referring to him as Coin or just Harvey, partly because he gave himself this nickname, also because this is how most historical documents refer to him, and also because I love a good nickname. So Coin Harvey was born in 1851 in what would become West Virginia. He was extremely ambitious and somewhat of a polymath. By 16, he was a teacher, but this was not enough for him. So by 19, he actually took and passed the bar exam and became a full-fledged attorney. While practicing law in Barboursville, West Virginia, Coin Harvey successfully defended a white man who was on trial for marrying a black woman, which was at the time illegal. Because, you know, racism. In his early life, Coin Harvey moved around a lot. First from West Virginia to Ohio, where he met and married Anne Halliday, then to Chicago, then back to Ohio, and then to Colorado, where he got into silver mining. He actually managed an extremely successful silver mine known as the Silver Bell. In a cavern, in a canyon, excavating for a mine. No, that song's about the gold rush. This was silver. Anyway, in 1884, the price of silver began to decline, and so Coin Harvey moved his family to Pueblo, Colorado. While he was there, he set up multiple businesses, and while many of these were successful and legitimate, others were less so. He began selling what he referred to as the elixir of life, but sounds kind of like snake oil to me. So while in Pueblo, Harvey became a major developer on a project that would be known as the Mineral Palace. This was going to be a grand exhibition hall that was built to commemorate the mining industry and mineral wealth of Colorado. Now, the project was eventually completed, but not before Harvey and his family managed to skip town. Seems he never actually paid the $5,000 he pledged to the project, which would be the equivalent of about $150,000 today. The Harveys next cropped up in Ogden, Utah. Now, here, Harvey set up a very successful real estate and law practice. Eventually, Harvey was asked to promote the town with a sort of grand festival that was going to incorporate elements of Carnival inspired by Mardi Gras in New Orleans. Now, unfortunately, this event was a bit of a failure and lost money. Coin Harvey made up the difference out of his own pocket. While Harvey had quite a bit of money in the Utah real estate business, he lost all of his equity in Utah during the Panic of 1893. Because of this, he picked up his family once again and moved back to Chicago. Now, this caused quite a strain on his marriage, as Anna was really tired of all of the moving and thought that Utah was going to be their forever home. While in Chicago during this economic downturn, Harvey became very interested in the free silver movement, which advocated for the unlimited coinage of silver. You can see how this movement might entice a former silver mine operator. Now, I'm no economist, And I know that if I attempt to explain the intricacies of the free silver movement in this YouTube video, I am going to fail miserably, but I will leave some general resources in the description down below if reading about old-timey, precious metal-based economic systems really gets your engine going. Anyway. Soon Coin began publishing his economic ideas in widely circulated pamphlets. These were very popular, the most popular being known as Coin's Financial School, where he staunchly advocated for bimetallism, which, again, if you're interested in, you can Google yourself much easier than I can try to explain it to you because, again, not an economist. Through his involvement in free silver, Coin began getting involved in politics, and in 1895 he founded an organization called the Patriots of America, which is a relatively generic name, but this group advocated for direct legislation and, say it with me, the free silver movement. Harvey campaigned heavily for William Jennings Bryan in the presidential election of 1896. But when William Jennings Bryan lost, Harvey became disillusioned with politics and decided he wanted a change. Harvey had visited Northwest Arkansas on the campaign trail, and he decided that he wanted to settle here because at the time, and I quote, "there are no large cities or really wealthy people." Times they are a-changing. So in 1900, Harvey purchases Silver Springs and decides to change the name, which is kind of funny to me because for a guy who was obsessed with silver, why would you want to change the name of the town you bought if it already has silver in the name? Anyway, Harvey claimed that he combined a Spanish and a Native American word to form Monte Ne, meaning mountain water, and he commissioned a song called Beautiful Monte Ne to promote the soon-to-be resort town. Harvey quickly began construction on a grand hotel, which he aptly named Hotel Monte Ne, and it included the first indoor swimming pool in Arkansas. He also commissioned a 5-mile-long railroad spur from the Lowell Junction to bring guests directly to Monte Ne because automobiles were in their infancy. Monte Ne was starting to thrive, but unfortunately, Harvey's personal life was suffering. In 1902, the Harvey family home was destroyed by fire, and this was the last straw for Anna. She quickly moved back to Chicago permanently, only to return to Monte Ne one time, and this was to attend the funeral of their son, Hal Harvey, who was tragically killed in a railroad accident. Side note, Hal is another great nickname. I feel like I could go by Hal if I was like 300% cooler. Anyway, Coin was devastated by Hal's death and built him a concrete tomb that was in the heart of Monte Ne. Eventually, years down the line, Harvey would actually share this tomb with his son after his death. By 1904, Monte Ne was bumping. Business was booming, and Coin Harvey had that sweet, sweet field of dreams mentality. If you build it, they will come. Unfortunately, I don't think he ever built a haunted baseball diamond. Just a couple of tennis courts and a golf course. Anyway, construction soon began on a massive complex on what was supposed to be 5 luxury hotels. The centerpiece of this was going to be called the Clubhouse, and it was meant to be opulent in every sense of the word. The lobby was going to feature a massive indoor waterfall, and listen, I love a good waterfall, but for the time, this was unheard of. Coin hired a renowned architect to work on the project out of St. Louis, Missouri by the name of A.O. Clark. Now, construction began quickly, but there was soon a huge problem when Coin Harvey increased the laborers' workday from 9 to 10 hours without increasing pay. Somewhat predictably, at least if you look back on it over 100 years later, the stonemasons and other workers formed a union and demanded better working conditions. Now, this enraged Coin Harvey, who hated unions because he saw them as another form of monopoly or trust, which... Anyway, eventually this all came to a head and led to an actual physical confrontation where Coin Harvey pulled a pistol on one of the stonemasons. Now, both men were arrested, but the case never went to trial. As the clubhouse debacle was winding down, Coin Harvey continued construction on two other hotels. The first was called Missouri Row, and it was built out of gigantic hewn logs with concrete floors and a red tile roof. Next was Oklahoma Row, and it was very similar to Missouri Row. Both of these were designed by A.O. Clark in that it was made of gigantic hewn logs and a red tile roof, but this one had a gigantic reinforced concrete tower on one end. Part of the log portion of Oklahoma Row was actually relocated up the road a piece before the lake was flooded. Soon, Monte Ne was a real town. It had a bank, a school, shopping, a bowling alley, and a railroad depot. So, what was a stay at Monte Ne like? Well, if you've ever seen the movie Dirty Dancing, I imagine it was probably kind of like that, except maybe less sexy. I don't know, maybe just as sexy, but in a sort of pent-up Edwardian sort of way. It was common for vacationers to spend their entire holiday at one resort for the week or weeks that they were on vacation, and they would rarely leave, if at all. Traveling places was very arduous, so it made sense to stay somewhere once you arrived. At the resort, guests could play tennis or golf. They could go swimming, inside or outside, which was a novelty at the time. They could attend concerts and fiddler contests, go on scheduled fox hunts. They could take daily constitutionals to take in the beautiful Ozark scenery. They could ride boats on the lagoon. The gondola was especially popular, and Coin Harvey was known to say that Monte Ne was the only place on Earth where the gondolas met the trains. While Monte Ne may have appeared successful, money was always a problem, and the resort was never as popular as Coin Harvey may have hoped. In 1907, the railway went bankrupt, and passenger service was severely limited. The 1908 season was a complete failure, and Harvey actually wrote to one of his children that he couldn't pay his taxes. 1909 saw improved numbers, but it still wasn't up to the standard that Harvey had hoped for. In this period of history, there was no state or federal highway system, and Coin actually blamed poor roads for part of the reason that Monte Ne was failing. He began to promote what he called the Great White Way. Now, put away your show tunes. This was a thoroughfare that was going to extend from Muskogee, Oklahoma, straight to Monte Ne, and this is a distance of a little over 100 miles, or 160 kilometers for those who are not on the imperial system. But eventually, the project stalled out. By 1913, lots at Monte Ne were starting to be sold off at auction. Coin blamed the city of Rogers, which is the town that now encompasses the land where Monte Ne once stood, for not supporting his project, but in actuality, the world was changing. Automobiles were starting to become more popular, and because of this, tourists wanted to stay multiple places and travel on their holidays instead of just spending it all in one place. In 1913, the Ozark Trail Association was founded, and this was part of the Better Roads movement. Coin Harvey became heavily involved in this organization, and eventually the network of roads would span from St. Louis, Missouri, all the way to Roswell, New Mexico. In 1914, the Bank of Monte Ne closed, and passenger rail service completely stopped. This pushed Harvey even deeper into involvement with the OTA. Now, the purpose of the OTA was to make maps and maintain signs and mile markers, but for Coin Harvey, this was a way to promote Monte Ne Resort. He even famously said at one point that all roads lead to Monte Ne, and he designed these obelisk-shaped mile markers to set along the roadways. Now, he seems to have had a thing about obelisks. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Coin Harvey had quite an abrasive personality, and in 1920, this actually led to a division in the OTA. In 1921, several members of the OTA walked out of a meeting stating that they had had all the experiences with Mr. Harvey that they'd care to have. As the Roaring Twenties were starting to gear up, Coin Harvey looked around him and saw that times were changing. He began to get very pessimistic about society and the world in general. Pessimistic about the world in the 20s. Can't relate. Eventually, Coin Harvey withdrew from the Ozark Trail Association, and this is where we start to see his ideas getting more out there. Coin Harvey became increasingly convinced that society was on the brink of collapse, and he published a pamphlet called Character Building. Now, I find this document very interesting because I really personally don't agree with a lot of what Coin Harvey did in his life, but reading this pamphlet, I agree with basically everything on it. I will read you a couple of excerpts, but I'm going to link it down below if you want to take a read. I guess people do grow and change, so here are some excerpts from Character Building by Coin Harvey. If you would be happy, be honest. A dishonest person is looking over his shoulder to see what is going to hit him. Prejudice injures the person who nurses it more than it does the person against whom it is directed. It ferments the mind and poisons the blood. Form an opinion of others without prejudice. Selfishness, covetousness, is a love of self, a desire to possess, regardless of the rights of others. It is the cause of 2/3 of the trouble in the world. Individual selfishness can crystallize into national selfishness. Wars of conquest, unhappiness, and suffering of tens of millions of people. Fascinating. I'm going to botch this quote, but isn't there a saying, or it's a phrase, it's, do I contradict myself? Very well, I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes. And I do think that Coin Harvey contained multitudes. As Coin Harvey continued to cast about him, his view of the world got darker and darker, and he was convinced that society was on the brink of collapse. Harvey became convinced it was his duty to create a time capsule or monument to what he believed was a doomed civilization. So he began raising funds for what he called the pyramid, but was actually going to be a gigantic obelisk. Coin wrote a book, creatively titled The Book, which was meant to be a sort of instruction manual on how future societies could avoid the collapse of this current civilization. Harvey's plan was to place this book inside the pyramid, along with various small articles ranging from a safety pin to a Victrola record player. There are even rumors to this day that there's a Model T Ford car buried somewhere beneath the waves of the lake that Coin Harvey had placed in this time capsule. Harvey was convinced that the valley would soon flood due to the end of days. And he wasn't exactly wrong about the flooding, just about the cause. He wanted to build the obelisk tall enough that once the waters of the Great Flood began to recede, an inscription at the top could be read, and it would say, "When this can be read, go below to find the record and cause of the death of a former civilization." So, he was really all in on this apocalypse thing. In 1925, construction began on an amphitheater called the Foyer. Now, this was going to be at the base of the pyramid, and Harvey didn't actually have a master plan. He sort of worked on the blueprint as he went along. Now, I'm no architect, but this seems a little reckless. Locals actually described the project as haphazard and unhurried. While Coin Harvey never managed to raise enough money to complete the obelisk, the amphitheater was actually completed in 1928. While the resort was relatively busy in the 20s, the hotels were still losing money, and eventually those properties were sold at auction in 1927. In 1929, the Ozark Industrial College and School of Theology used the facilities, and this school operated until 1932. Although Coin Harvey had long written in opposition to divorce, in 1929 he formally dissolved his marriage to Anna Halliday, who had been absent for years. He then remarried. He married his secretary, who was a woman by the name of May Leake, and this enraged the locals. So, build a doomsday pyramid, fine. Divorce, evil. Also in 1929, the stock market crashed and construction on the pyramid completely ended. And as the Great Depression was in full swing, Coin Harvey became the first Arkansan to run for president. He believed that the major political parties in the United States were not doing enough to address the suffering of the common man in the United States, and so he formed his own political party, which he called the Liberty Party. The national convention for this party was held here at Monte Ne, and 786 delegates were hosted from 25 states. One source I read stated that one of the delegates for the Liberty Party was a 7-year-old girl, so it doesn't seem like the qualifications were terribly stringent. Regardless of this, the delegates voted for Coin Harvey to be their nominee for president. He was 80 years old at the time, and several of the sources I read said he was rather reluctant, although he did accept. In order to combat rumors that Coin Harvey was a difficult person, the chairman of the National Committee of the Liberty Party stated, and I quote, "I deny that Mr. Harvey is unbearable." So, ringing endorsement. Despite all of this, Coin Harvey embarked on a really strenuous campaign tour. All of this amounted to nothing, though, and he eventually came in 5th in the presidential election. In 1934, Coin Harvey's health was in decline, and he actually fell down the stairs in the amphitheater and broke his hip. In 1936, Coin Harvey contracted intestinal influenza, or stomach flu, and this led to peritonitis. Not an economist, not an architect, not a doctor. On February 11th, Coin Harvey died with his wife May at his side, and he was interred on Valentine's Day next to his son Hal in the Harvey tomb. Over the years, May sold off the remaining land and water rights in the valley after Coin Harvey's death, so it seemed like his dream died with him. In 1944, Missouri Row was sold once again and eventually demolished. All that remains are a few scattered foundations and one lonely fireplace still standing out in the woods. Oklahoma Row, the remains of which are behind me now, and this beautiful chain link fence, was used by a summer camp for several years until it was purchased in 1955. The log portion was moved up the road a piece, where it still stands today and is used as storage, I believe. It's on private property, so I'm not 100% sure. So I'm currently parked in front of Monte Ne Inn. It's a famous restaurant around these parts for its chicken dinners. And I'm parked here because I wanted to show you guys the remains of Oklahoma Row. Monte Ne Inn is not the remains of Oklahoma Row. It's about maybe 500 yards behind me on the highway, but the thing about private property is it can be a little dangerous to go onto it without permission from the owners, and I'm not trying to do anything that will cause me any bodily harm or possible arrest. So I just wanted to let you know that it does exist, this log portion of Oklahoma Row. It's probably the largest portion of extant ruins from Monte Ne that is still visible above the lake. I'll try to find a picture to insert so that you know what it looks like, and if you ever come to Monte Ne, you'll definitely see it. You can't miss it. It's right on the highway leading to the boat ramp. But I just wanted to let you all know what was going on with that. And anyway, back to our regularly scheduled programming. By 1955, Monte Ne was little more than a gas station, a few houses, and a summer camp known as Camp Joyzell. My grandmother actually attended this summer camp and has some funny stories about the nature and memories of this place before the valley was flooded. My grandfather was college friends with a boy whose family owned land out here at Monte Ne and recalls that there were beautiful flowers lining the roads that led in. By the 1960s, this region was growing rapidly, and people began to realize that we needed a better water source to sustain the booming population. So plans were enacted to build a dam on the White River and create Beaver Lake. In 1960, construction began on Beaver Dam, and few people seemed to know or care that the remains of Monte Ne, the amphitheater, and the Harvey tomb were threatened by this new lake. My grandmother recalls that Monte Ne probably could have easily been saved, but people were just uninterested in saving it beyond relocating the Harvey tomb out of the flood path, as they did with all threatened graves. So this is Coin Harvey's tomb. I do believe it's on private property and I don't have permission to access it, so I'm just sort of filming it standing in the road from a distance. And it's really not very far from the lake itself. So you can see why they had to move it. As sad as that makes me, I understand that by the time Monte Ne was flooded, it was a ghost of its former self. I really wish I could have seen it in its heyday. Even now, when the lake is low enough, the ruins of the amphitheater resurface and you can walk out amongst them. I've never seen it personally, but I would love to. Not that I want a drought, but it would be cool, right? Monte Ne is on the National Register of Historic Places, but unfortunately, due to years of neglect and vandalism, what remains are husks of former glory and monuments, whispers of unrealized dreams. That was a bit of a downer, y'all, but I hope that maybe someday, with enough attention and the right funding, these ruins can be turned into something befitting the amazing history of this place. If you like this video, please do me a favor and leave me a like or toss me a subscribe. I'd really appreciate it. And if you're feeling it, leave a nice comment down below. I do read all of them and I don't tolerate excessive rudeness. So essentially, be kind or leave. I am planning on growing this into a series, so let me know if there are places that you would like me to cover. Thank you so much, and remember, the world is wide. Go find something fascinating.